So hello and welcome to episode 3 of our ACE Aware Nation conversation. It's so good to have you here. Today we're talking about ACEs screening. Two very special guests, as always, with us today. And we have Dr. Warren Larkin, who's a consultant clinical psychologist and visiting professor at the University of Sunderland. And joining us from Tampa in Florida, author and public speaker, Rena Romano, sur-THRIVING, I want to get that right this evening, of child sexual abuse, and we'll find out how that title came about in just a moment. Dr. Warren Larkin, hello and good evening to you. How are you today?
Hi, Gary. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm here in sunny Chorley. Well, it's not sunny at all. It never was, actually. But yeah, I'm here in Chorley. Not quite as exotic as Florida, I'm afraid.
Well, that's December for you, but we're absolutely honored to have you here today. So thank you for joining us, and we'll come to you in just a moment or two. Rena Romano, you are in Florida. I suspect that the weather might be slightly different where you are.
It's a little better here today. A little cloudy today, though. We're in our winter mode, but it's usually sunny Florida. So, yeah, love it here.
Well, it's so good to have you here as well, Rena, and we're honored. I know you've got a very powerful story to share with us. So I'll ask you to share that for us in just a moment or two. We know that screening generates some of the strongest feelings, particularly in Scotland, in the UK, when it comes to the UK Scotland ACEs discussion. So today, hopefully we'll shed a little bit more light on that. Many stories of trauma is not heard or even considered by systems, and we want to address that today. And evidence does say that most people would like their health providers to ask more about this. So let's explore that in just a second. Rena, you've got a very powerful story to tell. I viewed it earlier this week as part of your TED Talk, your TEDx talk. What compelled you to do that before I ask you a little bit more about your story? Because it was a very, very powerful piece. So what was the driving factors behind that, Rena, that made you stand up and share your story with the world?
Thank you, Gary. And it's an honor to be here with you and Warren and the others. So I am deeply honored to share my story. I'm 64 years young. I started being molested, raped at the age of 4. When I went through counseling, I just knew something was driving me. I knew that I would write a book. I knew in the back of my mind I would be a public speaker. I didn't realize, though, that I would be a healer or a teacher by using my experience. But I knew I was just driven to do something. I knew I was better than what was happening to me. And once I went through healing, I did 2 years of talk therapy with a group of other women. I've had hypnosis. I've done tapping. So I've just continued the healing through the years, even after I stopped counseling. But I just knew that I had something to say. And when TEDx came to the world, TED and TEDx, I want to share my story. And I was watching other people share their story, but I had a different message. I had a different spin that I wanted people to know about child abuse and about recovery, because it is possible. So my TEDx talk was born.
Okay. Would you be comfortable sharing a little bit of that story for people that haven't seen the TEDx talk? Would you be willing to share some of your personal story with us this evening? Because I'm sure it will ring true for a lot of people who are watching this tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gary. Yeah, if they want to watch the TEDx talk, they can go to YouTube and put in Rena Romano and TEDx. But I had started being molested at the age of 4, and it went on for almost 2 decades. And something I didn't bring out into the TEDx talk, in my early 20s, I was sexually assaulted in my home in the middle of the night by a colleague from work. And I couldn't go, I had to go to work the next day. And I couldn't tell my boss because my boss was sexually harassing me. And this was years before I got help. But the more the years went on, I felt broken, I felt damaged, but I knew that I wanted a better life. And then along comes Oprah Winfrey, the Oprah Winfrey Show, and I watched her religiously. And I saw her talk about her abuse, and she had other survivors come on and talk about their abuse and how their recovery. And I realized that talking about it was starting to be okay, and that it's okay to get help. And I like to tell people, get help, get healed, get happy, because it is possible. And one night, because I hadn't really told anyone, one night I was 34 and I was drinking myself into a stupor because I was into drugs, I was into alcohol, very promiscuous, and that was what happened because of the trauma. I didn't want to live that way anymore. I was in a lot of pain, but I didn't know, this was 30 years ago, how to ask for help. And I thought about suicide one night. And fortunately, I passed out drunk. And the next morning, I woke up and I remember seeing a crisis hotline number on the TV. And I reached out and I called. And it was a life-changing moment. Absolutely. The man on the phone was so gentle and calming, and he made me feel safe. And he made me feel proud for calling in, because I came from a time, and my mother and father, they came from the era where you suck it up, World War II, you suck it up and you put all your family business under the rug. You don't tell people your problems. So I was made to believe that asking for help was a weakness, but this man on the line, he was my hero. He made me realize that asking for help is very courageous.
We know from evidence that shame plays a large part in, and I know you're not a fan because we've spoken about this, of labeling people, but people that have been affected by trauma, sexual abuse in particular. Was shame a large part of your life up to that point when you were drinking? You said you were promiscuous and so on. Do you feel that shame was driving that reaction?
Shame was the number one reason, because I felt so disgusted, so damaged, so shameful that they made me feel that way. They made me feel that it was my fault. I was to blame. And so shame kept me silent. And I remember after I had been raped in my bed, months earlier, a friend of mine had been raped and she went to the police. This was 30 years ago, or, you know, 40 years ago when I was raped. And I remember her, well, what were you wearing? What were you doing? Blaming the victim for being raped. I was in my bed. I was asleep. That should be the safest place we are. We should feel safe. So shame, I remember what she went through. There was no way I could go to the police and report it. And let me tell you this, as a child, I was 4 years old. It was my brother who raped me for years. He was the adult. I was a 4-year-old child. I had no language for what was happening to me. I thought he loved me. And I could have a sense that it was wrong, but prior to molesting me, he was loving me and playing and buying me toys and treating me a certain way, differently than my other brothers and sisters. So I was led to believe that it was all my fault. So shame has I think that's the highest form of it, why we don't share and why we don't tell. And something happened to me, Gary and Warren, one night. I was watching Oprah Winfrey, my hero, my mentor, and she was interviewing Dr. Brene Brown on a series, her Super Soul Sunday series or something. And I remember this was years ago, and I was still hanging on to the shame. And Dr. Brene Brown says, shame is lethal. Shame is deadly. And I remember her saying that. I still get goosebumps. I jumped out of the chair and I was screaming and yelling, I am tired of being ashamed of crimes that I did not commit. And I'm not going to live this way anymore. And this was years after I even got counseling. I still had shame and it was keeping me from living my fullest potential. So yeah, shame is number one, Gary.
Rena, I'll come back to you in just a moment, and thank you for your honesty and your frankness in this conversation. It's extremely impactful. So thank you so much. Warren, if I could come to you, and we'll talk about maybe the Scotland and the UK's hesitancy to talk or to ask questions. But I think lots of people who are interested in ACEs have heard and talk about screening. They talk about scoring, as we know, and you talk about routine inquiry. Just to give us some context around that, Warren, what are the differences or similarities between those three practices, statements, words, phrases?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is, for me, the idea of asking people what happened to them was something that I learned from day one in my career in the health service, as in working in mental health. So for me, it's kind of natural that if you're working with someone and you're trying to help them, part of that process is called assessment, and part of that process is asking the right questions so you can develop an understanding of why somebody is in pain and how they got there and what might be keeping their difficulties going and what you might want to do to try and help them. So developing that shared understanding, as someone who works in mental health, as a psychologist, is fundamental to the process of healing. So that's kind of where I come at it from. I think there is a lot of controversy and there's a lot of debate about it, and some of it is around this notion of screening, and I think this term is very controversial and very divisive. My understanding of it is that screening, and according to the NHS, when I checked various definitions of it earlier, screening is about getting apparently healthy people from a certain population who may be at risk from a particular condition or illness, and then inviting them to come and have a test to determine whether or not they are indeed affected by that condition or illness, or at risk or increased risk of it, with a view to giving them early help and early intervention and explaining to them what their choices might be in terms of how we can support them, and helping them make an informed decision about how they want to move forward. So that's screening. It's a public health strategy, similar to what might happen if, when I reached 40, I got a letter from my GP saying, you've reached 40, you might be at risk of prostate cancer, increased risk, because many in your age group tend to be. Do you want to come and have a prostate exam? And we'll explain a bit of information about why that might be useful to you. And then I was left with a choice. Do I go and have this procedure and this test, or do I go, no, that's not for me? So that's a screening approach. The difference between what I do or what I teach people to do, which is routine or targeted ACE inquiry, is really an extension of that assessment process that I just talked about. So the key difference for me is if someone's seeking help, if someone's coming to me, say I work in a mental health service or a drug service or, a bereavement service or whatever it is, and they come to me and they say, look, I'm in pain, I'm having problems, I need your help. And then me as a provider, I say, well, okay, we do this thing called an assessment process, and I try and get to understand, how you got here and what's keeping these issues going and what we might be able to do to help you. So in that context, a help-seeking person comes to a provider and says, I want help. You then proceed with an assessment process, and that assessment process is part of your attempt to understand how those problems came about, what keeps them going, and what you might be able to do to help. And then that provides the person you're working with a kind of, together you come up with a shared understanding, and it provides them with a set of choices and helps them have an informed position. So I think the key difference is, one is people are seeking help already. They're already unwell, or they're already in pain, or they're already looking for solutions. And they've come to you and said, help me. So your duty of care as a professional is to find out and understand how their problem originated and what's keeping it going. So I think that's the fundamental difference to me between screening, which is a universal approach based on population attributed risk, where you think, yeah, this population might be at more risk, let's invite them all to take part, as opposed to asking someone in the context of help seeking.
And do our institutions do that? I mean, we see that there's evidence that people want to be asked. They do want to share their stories, but is there a hesitancy in the professional sector for us to go down any of those routes?
Well, I think there is. I think there's a huge resistance to it. I think partly it's anxiety on behalf of professionals and practitioners and workers. I think there's a natural concern that they don't want to make it worse. They don't want to upset people. They don't want to say the wrong thing. Maybe possibly I'm not the right person to be doing this. I'm not appropriately qualified. I'm not a therapist. So there's all of that, which is reasonable, but usually unfounded, because we know that most all of the studies that I've seen that have looked at trauma or adversity inquiry, it says that people appreciate being asked if it's done sensitively and appropriately. People understand in the context of seeking help that you might ask them what's happened in their lives. That makes intuitive sense to people. So I think a lot of the anxiety comes from the side of us as professionals and practitioners. I think the people that we're trying to help already know this stuff. It's not a surprise to them that they've experienced something traumatic. It isn't the first time they've heard it, but it might be the first time we've heard it. So I think a lot of the anxiety and concern comes from our side as professionals. You mentioned scoring as well earlier, and I think I didn't kind of respond to that, but I think that's the other divisive part. I think, people rightly look at the issue of scoring and feel uncomfortable about it. Even Rob Ander recently, one of the original authors of the ACE study, wrote a paper saying, look, it's the ACE tool has been misappropriated. It's being used to kind of assign risk. It's being used to allocate resources, and it's been used to, direct people along algorithms and care pathways. And I tend to agree. I don't think it was ever designed to do that. I use the questionnaire in my own work because it facilitates a conversation. The score is irrelevant. There's no value in giving a score to somebody from my point of view. The reason you will give a questionnaire is because it's clear. People know what you're asking. They don't have to say it out loud if they don't want to. They can just write a number on a questionnaire if they want to go, yeah, I want you to know, as my care provider, that I've had some of these experiences. I don't want to talk about which ones. I don't want to go into any detail, but it's useful for you to know that some of these things have happened in my life and they're still bothering me. So that's the value of a questionnaire, and that it's consistent across professionals. And bearing in mind, I just mentioned the anxiety that professionals have. If you look across 100 professionals and you don't use a questionnaire when you're training them to ask about adversity, at one end of the spectrum, you'll have somebody who'll say, hello, this is the bit where we ask about your early life and your life experiences in our assessment. How was your childhood? And the person will go, yeah, it was all right, thanks. And they'll go, marvelous, let's move on. And that will be the extent of the adversity assessment for some people. Right at the other extreme, you'll have a professional who is entirely comfortable, makes the person they're talking to feel comfortable, and goes through each question one by one. So you introduce huge variation if you don't have a clear set of questions that people understand and can respond to. So I think hopefully that helps a little bit with this issue of questionnaires and scoring. And
if I may interject something from a personal experience.
Yes, please.
We, on those applications, I'm not a therapist, I am not a lawyer, but on my website, I have a lot of survivors who contact me and want to share their story. Again, I'm not a therapist or a lawyer, but I do provide resources on my website that they can call. And I let them know, thank you for sharing your story, but here are some resources. And not long ago, I go to a new doctor, I have to fill out an assessment. Did your mother have cancer? Who had cancer? Any heart disease, cancer, lung disease, anything like that. And then there was a question, was there any childhood adversity? And if so, what? And that was the first time I saw that. And I'm like, yeah. So I wrote my story because I'd healed. And I told the doctor, I was very surprised to see that question. I don't exactly remember how it was asked. I was very surprised to see that question. And I think it's so important that we do ask. And I remember years ago, not long after I'd been raped and I had been dealing with almost 20 years of rape, I woke up one morning and I couldn't see. I could see things, but it was blurry. I called the eye doctor to go in immediately. And he did a complete thorough eye examination and he patted my hand. He says, "Honey, I don't know how to tell you this, but your eyesight is 2015. I think you're at the wrong kind of doctor." And he didn't know how to assess me or talk to me. This was 40 years ago. He wrote me a script of Librium. And I was too ashamed at that point. I was falling apart. I ended up having a mental and physical breakdown and going into the hospital. So recently, like I said, because I've done a lot of healing, but I think people are ready to start talking. The more we're talking about it ourselves, we're giving permission to survivors and victims that it's okay. And we need to give them safe places to talk.
There was a piece, Rena and Warren, actually, in one of our national newspapers today, The Guardian, and it was written by a journalist who was talking about trauma. And once again, you know, I'm aware of the words that we're using and labeling, but he summed it up by saying a sense of collective possibility, which we think is a really nice phrase. But he was basically saying that there is more of an acceptance now, or it's starting to be an acceptance in the UK of how our past affects our present. Does that indicate, Warren, I'll come to you first, does that indicate that there's a change in thinking in the UK when we start to see more articles like this in the national media?
God, it's hard to say. I think people are, like Rena said, you know, people are more open to talking about this now. I think this concept of trauma is far more in the public domain. I think it's intuitive. When you look at surveys of the general public and you ask them, why do people become unwell? Why do people become mentally unwell? The vast majority of people come up with an environmental and psychological explanation for that. They will say, usually it's when bad things happen to people. Usually terrible things happen to people and it makes it hard for them to cope. So intuitively we know that it's stress and burden and trauma and life events that affect our ability to thrive. So I think we've known that for a long time, but I think it's becoming socially acceptable to talk about that now. In the, you know, the Me Too movement, stuff that happened, you know, TV dramas and soaps in our country have tackled some of these very sensitive issues, you know, over recent years. And I think, like, you know, a few years ago, we weren't comfortable talking about mental health. We certainly weren't comfortable talking about suicide, which I think is very interesting because when I, you know, back in the day around when I started in mental health, we weren't encouraged to talk to people about suicide. We were discouraged because the belief was that it would somehow make people feel worse. And we actually know now the opposite of that is actually true, that it's very helpful to be open and upfront when you're talking to somebody who might have mental health issues or maybe at risk. It's best to be completely open and honest about suicide and whether they're experiencing those thoughts. So I do think things have changed. I do think we're more open and accepting. And I think, I'm sure Rena will give a more authentic perspective on this, but my sense is that there's more permission for survivors to come forward and say, if you do this, people might respond quite supportively and you might be believed, actually. And there's actually quite a lot of discussion and conversation happening at the moment about that.
Rena, when we were off air having our briefing, you said something that I took a note of when we were talking about that Guardian article, and I saw you get quite animated, actually. And your phrase was, "I'm not broken beyond repair." I hope I got that quote correct. What do you? Could you elaborate on that a little bit? And why did you get, when we talked about that article, sorry, Rena, when we talked about that article in The Guardian, why did you get so animated about that before we went on air?
Well, you know, for years I felt very damaged, very broken. I felt broken beyond repair. As we say, I didn't feel good enough. I have felt damaged. I didn't feel good enough to marry a marvelous man that I'm married to now, but because we weren't talking about it, because we were victim blaming, and that keeps us broken, and that keeps us stuck in the trauma. And we do need permission, and we need to know that we have a safe place where we can share our stories. We didn't commit the crime. Why are we stuck in the shame and the pain of what happened to us? It's because we're victim blaming. And it's the way we are talked to when we try to share our stories. But after a while, I mean, thank goodness here in the US, I don't know what you have in the UK, but watching Oprah Winfrey and back in the day, Phil Donahue and Sally Jesse Raphael, I was watching all those talk shows. And now everybody's talking about child abuse. We have actors and actresses, Oprah Winfrey says admits her incest and child abuse. And I'm like, wow, she can share her story and be a billionaire and be this successful woman. Maybe I am not broken beyond repair. And that's when I called for help. And it's because I kept seeing there was a hotline that was advertised on TV over and over. This was 30, 40 years ago. And if you have depression, if you're feeling, they weren't talking about suicide and they weren't talking about child abuse so much then. But the more we talk about it, the more we realize that child abuse, childhood trauma comes in all statuses and ethnicities. It happens to everyone across the board. And from the research I did here in the United States, 1 in every 3, they say 2 go unreported. So it's triple, double what the abuse status is. But to see people talking about it, Gary, it made me feel, wow, maybe I'm not broken beyond repair. There is hope because I want to live a happy, healthy, productive life. I want to be like Oprah. I want to stop being ashamed of something I didn't do. And it took a lot of healing. I'm not going to lie. It took a lot of work to get here, but I'm so happy it did. And I share in my TEDx talk a philosophy, Ginzuki, and it's a Japanese art of broken pottery. And instead of throwing the broken piece away, the broken pottery, they repair it with gold. And so it makes it more valuable than its first original bowl that it was. So that gave me hope, that philosophy, when I started researching and healing. We are not broken beyond repair, but we do need help, and we need empathy. And as I say in my talk, we need people that will listen without judgment, interruption, or judgment, because we didn't commit the crime. We did not commit the crime, so I wanted to stop doing the time.
Warren, Rena makes some really interesting points there and some questions that were going through my head in terms of the British culture and even the role that the media has to play in opening up our hearts and minds to trauma, to child abuse, to the whole area that we're talking about tonight. Do you think the British media or has a part to play in this, and what sort of effect do you think that could have if we became more open and honest in terms of having these conversations that we're having tonight, for instance?
Well, 2 things come to mind. I'll come to the media in a second, but in terms of what Rena said, she's talked about the shame and the barriers to disclosure. And I think if someone seeks help, what people kind of expect professionals to do is to create a safe space where they can tell us what's happened in their life. And what we also know is unless we give permission and we create a safe context, in the context of a trusted, relationship, an ongoing relationship, unless we give permission, we ask and we invite that disclosure, we invite the conversation, there are too many barriers otherwise. People don't disclose and share their deepest, darkest secrets that they feel very often might somehow have originated in terms of their own responsibility. If you're a child and someone abuses you, you tend to think it's your fault. So unless you invite and normalize that conversation and make it acceptable, people won't know that that's okay. It's not that it's okay to tell that we're interested and that we think it's relevant. And actually, what I've also found by using a questionnaire, and we sometimes use a conversational method, but by using a questionnaire, people see it and go, oh my God, this isn't just me, actually, this happens to lots of people. So that's quite helpful. But coming to the media, Vincent Felitti, the original author of the ACE study in 1998, said a number of times that he feels one of the best ways of educating the public, of changing the culture, of making it acceptable to talk about these things, is to use media, is to use mass media, is to use soap operas and dramas and, you know, storytelling and narratives on all forms, you know, all forms of media. So I think, and we've seen some great progress around mental health. We've seen some great progress around gender and sexuality, by you know, media outlets creating content that is acceptable and just puts across that message to people that this is happening every day to normal people, and that it's okay. You know, it's okay to talk about it. So I think the media can play a massively positive role. I think, unfortunately, there's still a lot of sensationalizing and headline seeking, it seems, and that's a shame, because I think there's a huge amount of good that can be done if the media and if journalists get behind some of these ideas.
If I may, Gary, if I may interject something here. Not long ago, I was invited to do an interview with a local TV anchor, and it was about the cost of rape and what the cost of rape or childhood adversity to the victim. And then I think the number was 150,000 US dollars over the lifetime. And I said, no, that's low. That number is low. So let's look at this as a community. We have addiction. We have drug addiction, food addiction. We have people dropping out of school. We have people killing people, driving drunk. What is that costing the community in not fixing these problems? As I went to speak to a women's prison, and I shared my story. And the many women in the audience, the prisoners, started crying, and they were given permission to stand up and share their story. And just imagine, had they been able to share their story and given a safe place before that time, their path may have not ended up in prison. So what's it costing a community? The communities need to talk about this. The media needs to talk about it. Stop sensationalizing it. You know, it's horrific, and we don't want to be sensationalized. We just want to be heard and validated and fixed. We want resources to heal, because we don't want to live like this. We don't want to live in addiction. And it's costing the community. Think about your local communities, what it's costing. Addiction.
Well, can I just add to that, Rena? I think the other thing I think is really important in all this is, you know, in California, they're doing this huge screening program, this test and learn program, and they've invested $143 million in this program in California. But it's not just about screening. Some of that investment's about educating the public and creating communication with the public. And I think that unless we do that, unless somebody has some information and some insight and can form an opinion, then they tend not to care about it. And if you don't care about something, you can't imagine it being different. So I think there is a duty, a part of this solution, a part of this kind of change that we're looking for is communicating with the public about this, you know, educating the public about this, making it okay to have a conversation, teaching children their rights as people when they're little, using the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child in school, you know, helping them understand what is healthy and what is unhealthy, you know, things like that. So part of this is a public health messaging job. It's a bit like you think about smoking. It took us 50 years to ban it in public after we knew it was quite good at killing people. We didn't get the messaging, we didn't get the change in culture and attitude right quick enough, did we?
Right.
It took far too long.
Rena, there's a strong feeling in Scotland, in particular, that we don't openly talk enough openly about sexual abuse. You've given me and the audience some examples of the work that you've been doing. Do you tend to find that in the States as well? I mean, from what you're saying, this seems to be a little bit more progressive. I'm assuming from what you've said to me, but is there still a hesitancy in the States to really open up to this?
I don't think so. Not like there used to be. We are learning to provide more resources, and we're finally seeing that, like the interview I did with the young acre, the cost to the individual and the cost to the community. I think we're opening up, definitely, and I'm seeing, when I share my story, that younger and younger people are coming up and saying that happened to me too. And then there are older folks that they're finally feeling safe enough to come up and say that happened to me too, and I never got help. And as my TEDx talk, there's the young man who did the graphic design for my book, His Puppet No More. He was so excited, he told his mother, and she started crying and said, yeah, she was in her 70s, and she said, that happened to me too. And she had been dealt with migraines for years. But finally, her saying that to her son, she told her family doctor, and her migraines started going away. So, yeah, I'm seeing it more. And I think, Gary, I think you brought this up with the Me Too movement. I'm seeing people that I went to high school with, women that I thought their life was perfect. You know, the cheerleader, and they came from the wealthy family. They came from the good side of the tracks. They admitted that that happened to them too in high school. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I was flabbergasted because I thought I was the only one. So the more we're talking about it, and the more we're seeing this, and the Me Too, and I love the internet can be a good tool, it can be a bad one too. But the internet is, with people are feeling a little bit more safe to say Me Too. It's phenomenal. It's just being phenomenal. So yeah, we need to talk about it. If we want to sustain our communities, we want to help our communities, we have to help our people.
Warren, in your experience, Scotland, the UK as a whole, why do we appear to be so emotionally avoidant when it comes to this subject?
Well, I think, in really simple terms, people tend to have a toward response to some things and an away response to some things. And, on a very fundamental level, this is one of those things that people feel uncomfortable about for various reasons. And I think that's part of it. But the way we become more familiar and more comfortable with these things is by making it okay to talk about it. The vast majority of people who get invited to talk about their adversity or their trauma in the context of a safe therapeutic space are not offended by that. They welcome it and they expect it, actually. So the whole thing about asking people about adversity, asking people about their lives, if it's done in the right context, if it's done sensitively, if it's done by somebody who's going to have an ongoing relationship, if it's an informed choice, if it's seen as part of a therapeutic offer that we're trying to help you, then that all makes perfect sense to people. The alternative is we wait until people who've experienced trauma and adversity and abuse to manage somehow to pluck up the courage to independently tell us. And I don't think that's fair. I also think it's at odds with our duty of care. I think if someone's seeking help from us, we have a duty of care to ask them about their significant life events, because we know that there's a causal relationship between certain kinds of life experience and certain kinds of illness and mental health problem and social outcomes. We know that, which is why the governor of California has invested $143 million in an ACEs screening program and a community intervention program, because the national, what does it stand for? The National Academy of Engineering, Sciences and Medicine have a consensus statement in the US, which basically say the evidence is so strong for the link between childhood adversity and poor outcomes across a whole range of measures that we advocate screening and a rapid response so we can help people as early as possible.
So, there's keep me right here, please, Warren. So there's when we go to a practitioner or we go for help or assistance, there's not a unified way of doing this. Depending on where we are in the country, will we get different levels of experience, different levels of practitioners asking us, questions, digging deep? And I suppose if we don't want to answer the questions, we can say we don't want to answer them. But is it quite piecemeal in the UK, this approach?
It's virtually non-existent, is the honest answer. There have been various attempts for the NHS to introduce routine inquiry about adversity or trauma. There was an attempt in 2005 where they piloted it in a range of mental health trusts, and it was seen by service users to be acceptable and valuable and useful. It was feasible for staff to do it, and it led to more informed care plans and help. But it fizzled out because it wasn't continued to be funded and supported by policy and the way things are measured. And the NHS meant that it just didn't happen. It's been policy since 2012 in England to ask people who are part of the care programme approach, which is the secondary mental health services way of coordinating care. It's been Department of Health policy since 2012 to ask everybody in that context who uses mental health services whether they've experienced physical or sexual abuse at some point in their life. And out of 56 mental health trusts, when myself and some colleagues did a freedom of information study not that long ago, only 5 of those trusts had returned any data to the Department of Health on whether or not their staff asked those questions. And when we asked for the audit of that practice, only 1 of those trusts said that they could provide it. And that never turned up. So the bottom line is that there's no evidence that this is happening routinely even in specialist services like mental health. I spend a lot of time training teams and organizations to incorporate inquiry about adversity and significant life events into their assessment processes. There's a process that we go through, and it's not just about the training, it's about readiness, it's about preparation, it's about planning, it's about thinking about what are the resources around that team should someone need specialist support. And it's also about how you conduct that inquiry in the context of assessment so that it's sensitive and that it's therapeutic. So I think we kind of know what good looks like, but it's not widespread. The incentives for it to happen in the National Health Service, for example, are just not there. There are so many pressures and so many other things that are measured. There's not even a place in the electronic health record in most organizations to record whether someone was asked about trauma or abuse or adversity. So I think the answer is there will be massive variations. There'll be some organizations and teams and individuals doing it brilliantly, and it's just what they do. And there'll be vast swathes of providers who don't do anything like this. Possibly they might ask one question about domestic abuse. If you're a health visitor, a midwife, there's a chance you might get asked about domestic abuse. But unfortunately, that varies massively, and a lot of people who are asked to do this, like health visitors and midwives, don't get a lot of training or support. And when my wife was asked about domestic abuse with our second child, I was sat next to her on the couch. So it's even where it has been sort of mandated that it happens, it doesn't always happen, and it doesn't always happen well. So I think we've got a long way to go before it's a routine or a targeted approach when people are seeking help, that we don't rely on chance. We don't rely on the service user to have the courage and the motivation and the kind of, strength of mindset to understand that that person there wants to hear it. We can't leave it to kind of all of those factors. What we have to do is make it clear to people that we're interested and that we're open to hearing this and that we're going to believe them and that we can do something to help them.
So is it a policy shift? Is it a governmental policy shift that we need? Is it policy shift change of mindset and investment? Is it all those sort of things? Because it seems like what we're looking for, giving people a voice, allowing people to be heard, for us in the UK seems a long way off, Warren.
I think it needs to be, if we're going to do it, you know, if we're going to kind of leverage the science and the evidence, we know that certain kinds of experience lead to certain kinds of outcomes for a lot of people. Not everyone, but for a lot of people. And we know that a lot of people that seek our help are affected by those issues. But yet we don't ask about them, despite the overwhelming evidence of 20 years of research into adversity and well-being. So that to me just seems like a massively missed opportunity. That can't continue. But unless we have policy and practice change, unless we incentivize organizations to do this, either by measuring and scrutinizing what they do. So in the NHS, nothing happens unless it's measured or mandated by the CQC or Monitor or one of the other organizations that oversee what the NHS does. So unless we make it, unless we kind of incentivize it at a national level, and we write it into policy, and then we fund those providers to make sure we train the staff properly, we create a place for them to record it properly, we make sure potentially there's some financial incentive or some sanction for not doing it, then the chances are it isn't going to happen. I mean, I was working with Department of Health in 2012 to try and bring about a rollout of targeted inquiry about adversity in specialist services. And that was a massive undertaking, but it fell flat when we got a new government. It suddenly evaporated. That plan that had been 2-3 years in the making evaporated overnight. So unless it matters to, unless it's a plan that cuts across party political practices, unless it's something that we see as fundamentally important as part of our public health response, then it's probably not going to happen, because you can't, if you rely on individual practitioners or individual services or individual providers to bring about this shift, you'll see pockets of good practice, and that's wonderful, but it'll take a really long time. And there'll be thousands and thousands of people who go to their GP or go to their pediatrician or go to the mental health provider who expect someone to say, what happened to you? And they'll not be asked.
I saw, I bring up Oprah Winfrey a lot, but she's my hero, my mentor. I saw her 60-minute interview, and I don't remember the doctor she was speaking with, but instead of asking what's wrong with you, that we start asking people what happened to you, because that is such a profound way. What happened to you? Because when we say what's wrong with you, that's judgmental. That's victim blaming again. But what happened? They may not be ready to speak up, but if we let people know that it's okay to speak up, if we start making the UK safe, that this is a public health issue all around the world, it's a public health issue. It's children are our most precious resource. And we have to take care of them. Of course, I'd love to see the end of child abuse. But what are we doing for those adults, who have gone through this? And if we victim blame them, then what are we sending the message to our children?
I think, can I just add to that, Rena? I think you're absolutely right. And very often services focus on treating the symptoms. So if you turn up with depression or with those migraines that your illustrator's mother had, they'll focus on the symptoms or the presentation or the problem behavior. And what's not happening is a recognition that often those problem behaviors or those addictions or that psychological pain is the manifestation of someone's underlying trauma or someone's underlying unresolved, adversity in childhood or developmental trauma. So I think for me, fundamentally, we have to go beyond what's on the surface, because actually you look at success rates in addiction services, for example, opiate withdrawal and helping people get off opiates, it's extremely low. And that isn't the fault of the people trying to help people who are addicted. It's the fact that services are commissioned with the behavior in mind. They're not commissioned with a significant therapeutic component, whereby we're able to give people individual and group therapy. We're able to address the underlying causes. We're able to help them understand what they've been through and how it's affected them and how it's maybe led to their way of coping. But crucially, that we're able to give them safer and better ways of coping and move on from what they've not move on, but learn to live with what they've been through in a way that isn't blaming or shaming or kind of detrimental to them, so that they can live and self-soothe and feel comfortable in themselves and in their lives without drugs. So very often, it's like prison as well. You know, we put people in prison because they've done a certain kind of behavior or committed a crime, but we don't provide them with the therapeutic support to overcome the things that led them to be there in the first place. They don't come out more competent and more confident and with more self-esteem. You know, it's quite the opposite. So unless we start looking beyond the surface issue and we start asking people about their lives in a sensitive way, we'll just continue having this excessive demand and people kind of living unhealthy and miserable lives where, you know, they're in pain all of the time because we haven't been brave enough to ask them the right questions.
And, you know, one other thing, Warren, if I can interject, Gary.
Of course.
One thing I know, when I had a major shift in my thinking about my past, and I tell people, and when they say, don't let your past define you, and I say, oh, no, 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 no. My past does define me. And this is why. I coined the term the Thrive perspective, and I had it trademarked. And the philosophy behind the Thrive perspective is to help survivors focus on their courage, strength, and tenacity to persevere during and after. I cannot change what happened to me. I don't have to be ashamed of it anymore because I did not commit the crime. So I look at it, my past does define me because I survived the unthinkable. And I am proud of my courage, strength, and tenacity. And that is the message that I give in my e-course that is sur-THRIVING After Sexual Abuse in my podcast. That is the message that I want to get out to victims and survivors. You didn't cause this. Be proud of surviving. I will never climb Mount Everest, but I did. You know, not to put down or diminish people who have actually climbed Mount Everest, but survivors and victims, we have achieved the unthinkable, and that is surviving it. So let's help them heal through it.
Rena, you're an inspiration. You really are. And, you know, you've obviously dedicated a very large part of your life, albeit you're how did you describe yourself?
They're a thriver.
Well, but youthful 64, I think you said at the top of the broadcast. But yes, and also that the phrase too. Has there been? I'm sure you've had tangible results from your work in the past. You know, and I would imagine that you've saved some lives doing the work that you do, telling the stories that you tell, and allowing people to be heard.
You know, honestly, Gary and Warren, I did not realize the impact that my TEDx talk was going to have. You're using it for training over there. I just had a story. I wanted to share my story, and I knew that it would resonate. And I hear from male and female survivors all over the world. Thank you. You spoke words that I was never able to articulate, but I've always felt. And so I know now this is my life purpose, is to share my story. I'm not ashamed. I'm tired of being ashamed. I'm tired of seeing our children hurt. I'm tired of seeing our adults lose their lives to addiction because of what was done to them. And, you know, sooner rather than later, I hope to see an end to child abuse. But the way to do that is to let the victims and survivors know that this is not their fault. And there is hope, there is help, and we have to give it to them. So the best compliments I've been given, Gary and Warren, is, when I hear from a survivor, and I'm going to start crying. Just recently, a young lady contacted me and from overseas, and she said, I started counseling because of your talk. And she's not the first one. Your talk gave me permission to seek help. So I'm not a therapist. I'm not a lawyer. I am a human being who had an experience. And if that experience can help others heal, then I'm doing my job. This is what I'm called to do now. So I want to thank you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Rena.
We're coming into the last few minutes of our broadcast. Warren, if I may come to you, in your professional capacity, and we do know that certainly Scottish decision makers, politicians, leaders see some of this work that we do, and the vodcasts, the podcasts, and they're very, very, very aware of the Ace Aware Scotland grassroots movement. So the decision makers, the people that have the power to move this forward, it's a big question. I tend to always end on the big questions, Warren. I don't know why I do this, but what would you say to them tonight, today, if they're watching this? What would you say is the next logical step to get things moving in the right direction, akin to what, you know, the story and the picture that Rena has painted for us in the States today?
Well, so it is a hard question. I think there's enough evidence now to know that childhood adversity affects people in a way that limits the quality of their life, that makes people sick, that affects people's mental health, affects people's social outcomes. We know that. It's very solid. So my point would be, if we know that that's affecting people that are coming to our services, let's make sure that as part of our assessment, where appropriate, we give people the option to talk to us about what's happened to them in their lives. But importantly, in order to do that, we need to give professionals the training and the confidence to do it, and the permission, and also the time to do it appropriately and therapeutically. And then what we do is we make sure that we've got the appropriate services to give people the help that they need. So the vast majority of people, when you've asked them about their life experience and their adversity, most people want to hear you say, thank you, I believe you, I appreciate what you've told me. That was very brave of you. And you're an amazing person for having got this far. And you know what? I'm here to help you if I can. We don't have to talk about it, but if you want to talk about it some more, I'm here to hear it, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm with you. Most people, that's what most people want, because it's been a massively big deal for them to trust someone to tell them. So they want to feel validated, accepted, and believed. And if you get a chance to say, look, that wasn't your fault, that happened to you, not because of you, that's another powerful opportunity. But in order to do that, you have to create places and spaces in the flow of healthcare and, the flow of services where it feels appropriate and safe, and where professionals feel equipped to do it. So and the one thing that I would say, in California, they've got this massive program of ACE screening. There are some things I think, well, great, good on you. You're doing something and you're trying to learn through it and you're trying to do it well. But actually, I think my opinion is that professionals probably need a bit more than a couple of hours of online training. They need some time to think about it and plan it and think about what the implications are for their job. We have to think about how we record it and write it down so people aren't asked repeatedly or asked once and then never again. We have to think about how we provide safeguarding responses to people. We have to think about what the right kinds of support are. If people want more than my support and my kind of listening, if they want specialist help, let's make sure people get that, because we know that there are some really effective trauma-focused therapies for the percentage of people that do need those. But the problem is most people can't get access to them. So I think we just need a full recognition of the impact of adversity and trauma in people's lives as a massive public health problem. We try and prevent it where possible by moving upstream, but we haven't been able to do that. We assume that most people who come to see us have experienced something, and we ask them in a respectful way whether that's something they want to look at as part of our assessment. And that way we're not leaving it to chance, and that way we've got a chance of giving people early help, giving people the right help. And for them, and even if they choose not to tell us, they know that in future they can come back. We've given permission, we've put it on the agenda. so they can come back when they're ready to talk to us about it.
And Rena, final word from you, if I may. Can anybody become a sur-thriver?
Thank you for asking. I felt so compelled. I was a survivor. I was a victim, a survivor, a thriver. That just didn't sit right to me. So I trademarked that word here in the United States, sur-thriver, because I've been able to release the shame of the crimes committed against me. And now I'm thriving. And so I'm keeping my past, experiences with me to show others that there is hope, that they can get help, get healed, and get happy, and that we have nothing to be ashamed of. So for me, sur-thriver, I have so many survivors. I love that word. So I'm starting a movement, a no more shame campaign. I am a proud sur-thriver, and I'm taking back my life. So that's my movement, and I'm going to go around the world with it. And I want to thank you for having me here tonight. I suggest you send this video and the transcript to all your politicians, everyone in the medical field. Send this out to them. Let them know how there's nothing more sexy than somebody healing and getting their life back. And it's possible. There's just an endless positive possibilities for healing. And that's what I want to share. So thank you for having me here.
Well, thanks, Rena.
It's been just over 60 minutes. It's been insightful. It's been inspirational. It's been wonderful. Thank you to you both, Rena and Warren. Thank you for your time. You've been very generous. Yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. We're back next year. Can you believe we're saying that? We're back in 2021 on the 27th of January. The language of suffering is the topic the next time around. And how do we talk about trauma? And what language should we use, and why is it important? And we'll be joined by Lisa Cherry, who's a trauma specialist, and Joan Smith, who is a journalist and an author. So from me, Gary Robinson, from the whole team, have a wonderful holiday season when it comes around. We'll be thinking about you. Take some time out with your families and with each other if you can, and we'll see you in January. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.